Our membership base ranges from communists, socialists, Greens voters, all the way to nationalists, liberals, classical liberals, libertarians.
How does a communist become a member of a classical liberal society? Who is to blame for the housing crisis, and what are the solutions?
It is actually such a terrible policy. I really can't think of a worse. Oh, maybe I could. It's up there at the top with just some of the worst housing. I think it's an abominable policy. So I'd love to see Australia embrace, one, nuclear, and two, a kind of Ezra Klein abundance agenda. I'd say, I'm a proud globalist, proud free trader.
Australia is a multicultural society, and no matter what people on the right might want to happen, that isn't going to change. So
I love immigration.
There's clearly a lot of problems with the Liberal Party. So they need to be looking at their messaging around issues like immigration. If I was from these communities, I'd probably think the Liberal Party might be a little bit racist from some of the messaging that has been coming out from certain individuals in the party.
Susan Ley is the leader, but how long for is a question. Andrew Hastie is the opposite of where I'd like to see the Liberal Party go.
I think there's one very clear reason why capitalism leads to a more progressive society.
So Anthony and Sam, what is classical liberalism? Please explain.
So the first thing to point out is classical liberalism is quite broad, but there's a couple of very important ideas that we all subscribe to, and that's things like free markets, individual liberties, and freedom of speech. I'm sure Sam will have a lot to add on about this.
Yeah, it's a reasonably diverse kind of umbrella. So you'll have people within the classical liberal umbrella that agree on certain things in regard to the extent to which government has a role in society. So you might have some classical liberals that are more open borders and some that are more closed borders. So the broad idea is, yes, so limited intervention in markets, civil liberties, and free speech, but free speech comes under civil liberties.
Yeah.
And who would be some of the key historical figures in the development of classical liberalism, just for the benefit of our audience and for those who are interested in reading up on it?
So Friedman Hayek would probably be the main classical liberal. Milton Friedman, for more of the economics, for the economics, would consider himself a libertarian / classical liberal. Anyone you?
Well, I'd say that's kind of like the economic philosophy from it. Then politically, it's a bit different. So I think England has quite a history of this. So figures like George Lloyd, Winston Churchill were kind of early classical liberals. I believe the Tories were kind of founded as a classical liberal party. If you're looking to more of like a modern kind of extent of that, people like Thatcher, Reagan, highly influenced by the ideas of Hayek and Friedman, and that would be kind of more of a modern take on it.
Javier Milei, to be the most contemporary, would be, so libertarians come under the classical liberal banner. Javier Milei would probably be the most contemporary classical liberal leader we have at the moment.
And I guess you could probably class John Locke in there as well as one of the earlier figures. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, in terms of the intellectual development of classical liberalism, definitely.
Yeah. And just in terms of, what sort of impact has classical liberalism had on just the world in general? Like, what historical settings have we seen it sort of play out in? I know that with regard to communism, there's debates over whether certain societies were truly communist or not. What's a sort of example society that sort of practices classical liberalism well?
I think
it's more historic, isn't it? Like 1980s, Reagan was aggressively pursuing it, but he didn't fully because government spending never got significantly cut because, of course, he massively upped military spending to deal with the Soviet Union. So it's very difficult to point to someone who was keeping that ideological purity, especially given classical liberalism is so broad. So by virtue of its broadness, it can sometimes be difficult to truly pin it to...
Yeah. I mean, I think you can point to earlier examples of something like property rights. So something like property rights, so the famous quote is kind of, a man's home is his castle, right? The castle, the Rob Sitch film in 1997. So I think something even as simple as property rights, which we take largely for granted, or even the idea of the rule of law, equal treatment, I think democracy, to an extent, came out of those kind of classical liberal values. So it's hard to measure the direct impact when you account for the fact that the definition of classical liberalism might have changed and there are different areas within classical liberalism. But property rights, for me, would be the main contribution.
I guess if we're going down that route, you can also point to 1980s when you're looking at kind of the Hawke-Keating years. There was a lot of free trade, deregulation, carrying that on into the Howard years with GST reforms and lowering taxes would probably be within that.
I don't think that the GST would come under the classical liberal, but I think, so the low reduction in taxation is probably, I guess, under Howard would be classical liberal.
And, well, the reason you're on the podcast is because you've set up a student society, obviously at ANU. Would you like to tell the audience about that student society?
So the first thing I'd like to start off by saying is that we're not just at ANU, we're also kind of branching out into UNSW, and we're trying to create content that's available to everyone Australian-wide. So just because you're not a Canberran or an ANU student, don't be scared to interact with our society or follow us on our socials. We're creating stuff for everyone. The second thing I'd like to point out from the start is that we're quite an ideologically diverse grouping of individuals. So, of course, we are called the Classical Liberal Society, but we have people who are more Labour-leaning within our executive towards people who are more Liberal-leaning to those who are disinterested in what the current two major parties are offering anyone. So we're kind of open to everyone. Now, talking more specifically about what we do, there's a number of things. One of the first things that we do is that we try to create more debate on campus, because we noticed as second-year students that in our time throughout university so far, we hadn't seen many ideas being challenged. So we try and get onto campus, have like a whiteboard which has a statement like capitalism leads to a more progressive society, and we can encourage students to come up to us, share their thoughts. We can share our thoughts, try and create some constructive dialogue. The secondary thing that we do is we hold events such as politics in the pub or economics in the pub, which is a kind of very low-key, chill setting in which we have a public intellectual, a politician, etc. come to campus and give a short talk about an issue they might be passionate about. For example, government intervention in the ACT was an event we recently held with Mark Pardon, which was quite a successful event. We have food and drinks, and then we offer a Q&A session afterwards where people can ask questions they might have of this figure, and we get a lot of good engagement from that. We have a bunch of other things in the pipeline that we're thinking of developing, such as a bit of volunteering stuff, a couple of social events, bigger events, but currently that's been our basis of what we've been doing.
Yeah, so, and I'll preface that with the fact that we're not affiliated or aligned or connected to any political party. So a common misconception, which is very reasonable, is that we're connected to the Liberal Party. We're not. And then in terms of, so our executive would be Labour voting to, as Anthony said, Liberal voting to someone maybe more like me who kind of is more independent, not party political. And then the other thing to note would be our membership base ranges from communists, socialists, Greens voters, all the way to nationalists, liberals, classical liberals, libertarians. So it's a real melting pot. And to summarize what Anthony said, the society is largely surrounded around two things, which is, one, the promotion of classical liberal values. So, as Anthony said, we have events on government intervention in the ACT or libertarian economics. And then the other thing is trying to get a bit more debate and discussion on university campuses.
We like to think of ourselves as being like a marketplace of ideas.
Or trying to turn universities into a marketplace of ideas.
Interesting. So you mentioned that there's a sort of broad political spectrum of your members. Explain to me, how does a communist become a member of a classical liberal society? I assume they probably wouldn't agree with classical liberal principles, but they're keen to listen to the discussions. Is that the sort of dynamic that's going on, or am I wrong?
I think it's kind of both, like they're willing to listen to the discussion, but I think it's also noting that you don't have to be a classical liberal to share some classical liberal beliefs. For example, you could be a communist that kind of believes that people should have some more economic freedom from central banks. So they might be supportive of something like Bitcoin, which is something we experienced recently.
or you could be centre-left and believe in free speech. The other thing is that the classical liberal society doesn't have a requirement that you agree with classical liberal views or you are a classical liberal. If part of our point is to create that contestation of ideas on university campuses, we've been actively trying to get people on the left, far left, center, apolitical, to come in. I mean, membership, the point of the society isn't centered around membership. So you don't get exclusive deals or anything. The main thing is just bringing people together who want to discuss more ideas.
Well, how receptive do you think university campuses, or I mean individual students have been to that sort of open discussion? Because there's been a lot said by people of the sort of classical liberalism bent in the last decade or so, claiming that universities are sort of antithetical to free discussion at the moment, or there's sort of an environment of sort of suppressing or attempting to prevent free discussions. What's been your sort of observations about how students have reacted to hearing ideas that are different from their own?
Yeah, so I think, and I'm going to borrow part of Anthony's answer to the last question, which was, you don't have to be classically liberal to believe that we need to reform permitting and zoning in what I think is a very classical liberal belief, which is giving people the freedom to build and use their land as they like. So I think a lot of people are interested in certain elements. Again, you might have someone on the center left who is very much open to freedom of speech. So I don't think I think people often tend to be more single issue or selective as to where they agree with classical liberal thought. On the whole, our experience has largely been positive. I mean, we have really good engagement at our events. There's a great photo on our Instagram of a libertarian talking to a communist. And to me, that is so beautiful because that represents what we want to do. So yeah, I'd say pretty good engagement.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is kind of our engagement is increasing. So each event we sell more tickets, which seems to indicate that people are kind of liking what we're doing and getting excited about what we're doing. The second thing is, I think it's kind of a case of the narrative driving outcomes with university debate. So I feel like everyone in the media or social media are talking about how kind of universities are so left-wing, so people should be kind of scared to show dissenting opinions. And I feel we're kind of internalizing these narratives within ourselves. So I don't think that it's the fundamentals of universities are actually inherently super left-wing or everyone who goes to university is super left-wing. I think it's a case of just more people needing to get out there, showing contradictory opinions, and that encourages more people to be kind of vocal with their dissenting opinions. So once, for example, we get on campus and people see that there's other people that think like them around, I feel like we're encouraging others to be confident in their own views. And I think we're seeing that. Like, we're getting more people coming to our society as they're seeing lots of other people are turning up, so they think it's a safe space to share ideas. And I think that's very important and something that we've been very excited to do.
Yeah, sorry, just quickly, I didn't address your part of the question with regard to freedom of expression on university campuses. Speaking from personal experience at the ANU and knowing people from most universities around Australia, I would say there tends to be an aversion for people who aren't left of centre to speak up. And I think part of that is due to university students leaning, ever so slightly left of centre on average, say once you account for kind of the extremes. And I do think there is something within the universities that does discourage that. I think universities have tried to create very safe and inclusive environments, but in some cases they have tended to exclude or discourage certain opinions.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of even when they frame lectures sometimes. They can do it from one side of politics. But I think kind of the take-home message that we want to send is that I don't think universities should be a place where you should be scared to share your opinions. And from our personal experiences, we haven't seen any backlash from what we're doing. So we think we're just creating more positive discussion. and encouraging more people to be confident in their views.
That's interesting because in the US, obviously there's Stephen Crowder is an example of someone who does a similar method of activism, I think you could call it, or trying to convince people of his political views with that sort of change my mind style outreach at university campuses, and obviously a lot of his content is based around people reacting adversely to him being on campus and viewing him as an agitator. You haven't received any of that sort of reaction?
I think in America, people feel a lot more passionately. So, a lot more passionate about certain issues. And I think, show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes. Stephen Crowder tends to clip, as you say, the most reactionary people. So I'm sure that for every very reactionary person, there's a lot of people who might just have calm conversations. And even some of his videos have people who are calmly engaging. But I haven't had any adverse... I mean, there are a few people who have been slightly reactionary and not, willing to shout out something, but then if you followed up, they're not really interested in engaging further. But nothing of, we don't have people coming up and shouting at us to get off campus. It's very respectful.
And I think it's even part of how we're framing it. It's kind of like, does capitalism lead to a more progressive society? What are your thoughts on this kind of issue? Come and speak to us. We're trying to frame it in the most constructive way possible to have a robust debate, yes, but have a respectful debate at the same time. So we're not trying to make people angry. We're just trying to respectfully challenge them to think critically about why they hold the opinions they do, and hopefully create change through that organic way.
One of the key issues facing young people at the moment is the housing affordability crisis and also the cost of living crisis, but we'll focus on the housing affordability crisis at the moment. People from across the political spectrum blame certain groups or individuals. For some people it's landlords or developers or big corporations, and for other people it's the government. Who is to blame for the housing crisis, and what are the solutions?
So we should say here that Anthony and I have founded this society and this group, but we disagree on quite a lot. So I'll take this first, then I'll hand it over to Anthony, because we'll probably have slightly different answers. I would say it is almost solely caused by the government. I would say that what we've essentially done is increase demand through things like negative gearing, first home buyer grants, capital gains discount taxes. So you boost the demand. More people can buy a house, more people want a house. And then what we've done is we've regulated the living out of actually building a house. If anyone's tried to do a renovation or build a house, they'll know just how difficult it is. The National Construction Code is 1,500 pages. I mean, that is just incredible. And that's ignoring kind of local permitting. So essentially we boost demand at a federal level, and then both at a national, state, and council level, we constrict supply. So we make it really hard to build, and that's also through things like occupational licensing. So I would say it is, to a very great extent, if not solely, caused by the government.
So I think Sam's correct in some extents. I disagree on other levels. So I think we've got both a demand and a supply issue that's going on. So we've got large levels of immigration, which is a demand cause for housing prices going up. But one of the reasons that this is is having such a negative impact on housing currently is because of what Sam's talking about government intervention, how regulations, how government policies are making it difficult for the market to respond to the increase in demand. So I think that's one separate thing. I think it's also, we have to have a serious discussion about how we plan our cities in modern society. So what I'm seeing, for example, on the North Shore is we seem to have a large juxtaposition between very high density apartments and very low density housing. We don't seem to see much widespread adoption of medium density zoning within Australia. That's something that to me would seem to make a lot of sense, like that European style of the courtyard with the kind of two-story houses would be a way to increase density on a sustainable level while maintaining the character of a neighbourhood, maintaining community. Sam would disagree with the government mandation of this. What I'd point to more is that we probably have to relax zoning laws to allow for more medium density would be a solution for me. The last thing I'd like to point out is in jurisdictions like the ACT, the government has a monopoly on land. They tend to own all of the land. So if we are getting a housing crisis in a jurisdiction like the ACT, it's a result of the government not releasing enough land to property developers. Because if we have the demand, the market would respond to meet that demand if it weren't for distortions from the
regulation. Yeah, I mean, my answer would be radical imposition of just pure capitalism in housing. I mean, seriously, strip back demand with all these tax concessions and discounts, and then just, I mean, in my ideal world, or just abolish councils or something. Just give people the real freedom to build and what they want to do with their property. And yeah, I mean, house prices, I think, are pretty clearly overpriced and overvalued. So I don't think I wouldn't be averse. And this is someone who's will inherit a house. I would be very okay with house prices declining.
Yeah, I'd probably be a little bit less radical, so I wouldn't be supportive of
He's got a nicer house
I wouldn't be supportive of the councils getting abolished, but I think there's a lot of areas where we can cut a lot of red tape, and I think we need to have a serious look at reform into housing regulation, into how we're zoning stuff in Australia, and have a think about what we want our country to look like in the next 10 to 20 years, how we design the cities, where the density is, and yeah, I don't know all the answers, but there's definitely something wrong.
So the Albanese government's, was it 5% deposit scheme for first home buyers? You think that has to go?
It is actually such a terrible policy. I really can't think of a worse. Oh, maybe I could. It's up there at the top with just some of the worst housing. Let's give people 5%, so they've in effect got a leverage of about 20x, and let's not income test it so that people with very wealthy families can get it, and so can people with families who don't have a higher income or wealth. I think it's an abominable policy. I mean, part of the part of me that thinks, oh well, I'm going to inherit a house. Honestly, I think great, because it's just going to make prices go higher.
And I mean, that's the whole issue with it, is it's just going to exacerbate the demand issue, because it's not dealing with the root of the problem, which is supply. So it's a failure of a policy, in my opinion.
Something that you guys touched on earlier was one of the claims or statements that you were arguing for on university campus, which was that capitalism leads to a more progressive society. A lot of people will hear the word capitalism and associate it with conservative parties, especially in Western political systems. Please explain to people or justify or reason how capitalism leads to more progressivism.
So what a lot of people said when we put that up as a motion was, it depends on how you qualify capitalism, how you qualify progressivism. I would say, if you map it out on what is the average income, and then you have an index measuring how progressive a society is socially, you see a positive relationship, and then there's some outliers like Qatar. I would say broadly, I don't think you can have heavy-handed government intervention with civil liberties. I don't think you can have things like strong free speech or individual, expression when you have a massive government that controls everything. So I think empirically we can rule it out, and I would argue theoretically. And then with the economic side of things, I think capitalism has meant massive price decreases in certain things. So if you look at how long it took someone working to light, a 1 hour of light, it used to be a couple months or something, and now it's a few minutes, right? So I think capitalism allows for it's the allocation of resources such that things get cheaper, competitors compete, so prices drop and quality goes up, and capitalist societies have the most innovation. And I think things like the fact that most people can afford an iPhone and AirPods is incredible. I think this is amazing technology that even your working class can access.
I mean, that's talking about technological progression. Was your claim encompassing social progression as well?
Yes.
Yeah, so
And I guess that's something I can speak to now. So I think there's one very clear reason why capitalism leads to a more progressive society, and I think it's the profit motive of a firm. And I think there's a reason for this is kind of when you're a firm looking to maximize your profits, you don't care what the color of your labor's skin is, what their gender is. You just want the most efficient worker. So I feel like that tends to lead to racism and sexism leaving societies because firms maximizing profit want just the most efficient workers. It's things like, for example, the Woolworths picketing case in the United States during the civil liberties period in the 1960s, in which Woolworths was segregated in the South. It wasn't segregated in the North. African Americans, consequently, in the North began to picket against Woolworths, and Woolworths realized they were suddenly going to lose a lot of money if they didn't desegregate. So you see that market forces, people pulling together to pressure private organizations, can lead to more progressive outcomes because the firms are only caring about profits. Secondarily, I just think that we can just see it empirically. The evidence is that more capitalist societies tend to be more progressive. Let's even look at an example on environmentalism. People might critique countries like the US for having poor environmental standards, but it wasn't the US that had one of the second largest lakes in the world getting shrunk. That was, in fact, the Soviet Union, which through its agricultural collectivization policies created massive environmental disasters. And that's all because of a lack of accountability that doesn't exist in non-capitalist countries but does exist in capitalist countries.
And just to qualify my point earlier, so you raised that it was technological innovation. I would say that technical innovation comes from capitalism through the profit incentive and allocation of resources, or largely capitalism at least, and that has led to greater economic equality in terms of access to technology.
Another key issue that by polling data young people are concerned about is the future of the climate and the future of the environment more broadly, but specifically on the climate. There's been a lot of initiatives announced by Western governments, by the Albanese government, by the Canadian government, British government, a bunch of European governments, by the Biden administration, to aiming to reduce global warming. Do you think that, well, firstly, do you think that we should be aiming to reduce emissions?
Yes.
Yes, within kind of qualifications.
Okay, do you want to briefly explain some of those qualifications?
I think we should lower emissions, but not at an extremely fast pace. And I can get into why, but here's the summary of why not would be, if you rapidly decarbonize, I see a very plausible risk of energy prices shooting up and then getting a movement like Farage in the UK or groups that will outright deny climate change. So if you go too fast, too quick, energy prices go up, that is detrimental to the whole economy, and you could then see reactionary groups. So I'm wary. I don't want to trigger a reactionary force that is wholly against climate change.
Well, what do you say to the counter-argument, though, that if you go too slow, then a lot of the adverse impacts of climate change are going to happen anyway, and it's going to affect our infrastructure and our society in a way that has a worse impact than any potential backlash could have from going too quickly?
Well, I don't think Australia doesn't take up enough of the emissions percentages globally for us as a nation single-handedly to stop climate change. So I think we need to, given that observation, I think we do need to balance between reducing emissions and the economic damages that would come by doing them too quickly. What I think something tangible we can do is to focus on dealing with what are the side effects of climate change going to be on our ecosystems, on our economy. That looks like maybe we need to invest more in rural firefighting to stop the increased prevalence of bushfires that may occur if we have increased global temperatures. So I think that is something tangible we can do. But given the observation, we can't single-handedly stop climate change. So we need to balance between reducing emissions and ensuring our economy and our energy prices aren't massively detrimented.
Yeah, so it's a good question that I wrestle with myself, and I can't give you a clearly set and thought out answer because I haven't found where to plant my flag. But I would say broadly, if you were to, we are notoriously bad at predicting the future. So I don't know how much we can rely on certain modeling that shows complete ecological collapse if we reach a certain temperature. I'm wary of modeling and trying to predict the future. I don't think we've been particularly good at it. And I think we've been consistently saying, or some people have, that the environment is about to collapse, or maybe that's a bit of an extreme example, but we're going to have effects that we haven't seen. So I would rather, given the risk of sparking a party or sparking a reaction that is wholly is completely denying climate change, I think it's a worthy trade-off, and I don't think that the effects that have been claimed are actually going to come out if we don't reach net zero by, let's say we reach it in 2060 or 2070 instead of 2050.
Okay. In terms of what we can do as Australia, obviously we don't constitute the majority of the carbon emissions worldwide. That's mainly made up by India, China, and the United States and Russia. What can we do? Are our hands tied, or are there certain things that we can do on the world stage to try and encourage those other powers to reduce emissions? Because it seems from what you're saying and what both of you have been saying that climate change is really out of our control.
I don't think that's true necessarily. I think there's a couple of things we can do. First, we can focus on the amount of land clearing that's occurring in Australia. Sam might disagree with me here, but we do have a lot of trees, and trees help absorb carbon dioxide. So if we can help promote biodiversity within Australia, I think that's a tangible way that we can be helping to mitigate climate change instead of just focusing on emissions. A second thing that we can do is looking about what products we're buying. So yes, we aren't contributing to the strict emissions that are occurring in the world, but we're a large consumer economy which imports a lot of goods from countries like China, India, the United States, which are large polluters. So if we put out messaging like the government, informing consumers about kind of where they're buying their products from and what these countries' environmental standards are, we can actually have a positive effect on climate change through our market power by the individual consumer deciding no longer to buy certain products that were produced in environmentally harmful ways. Now, Sam and me might probably differ on the extent to which the government is involved in encouraging consumers to not buy from these kind of countries.
Yeah, so I'm not a scholar of international relations, so I can't tell you that Australia should sign up to this treaty or that. I'll happily admit that's where I fall short intellectually, or one of the areas I fall short. One would be probably producing more gas, given that a lot of Asian countries heavily rely, or at least rely on to a reasonable extent, on Australian gas. And if you take gas from these countries, they're going to move to coal, which is significantly worse. So I'd say producing more gas. The other way, I would love to see Australia embrace nuclear. As someone who has a reasonably as someone who has a rough understanding of the energy system, and as someone who's worked in the legal compliance side of renewable energy, these things are incredibly difficult to build on a regulatory level. So average permitting times for a wind farm is probably at least 10 years, probably more. And that is incredible, right? So we're trying to transition and build out lots of renewables and solar and wind, but the government makes it, and at all levels, makes it so difficult to build these things. So I'd love to see Australia embrace, one, nuclear, and two, a kind of Ezra Klein abundance agenda, which is let people build tons of. I want more energy in the economy. So I'd love to see Australia embrace mass deregulation for an agenda of abundance where we just build more energy, and hopefully that could send a signal to other countries. But again, I'm not well versed on the influence issue.
I'll get you guys to engage with some criticisms of classical liberalism from the left and the right. Some common criticisms from the left of classical liberalism, well, one of them is that it's really just an ideology for rich people and people who are benefited by the system. The one that advantages people who already have money, one that doesn't provide a social safety net to disadvantaged people, and in that way it's not truly meritocratic, it's more based on, it's more like an oligarchy. What's your response to that critique?
So I'm going to be a little cheeky here. I'm going to say it depends how you define capitalism. So if you were to if you rank economic freedom, so that the Heritage Foundation ranks countries by their economic freedom, and the index is made up of about 9 areas, so rule of law, fiscal policy, level of debt, level of regulation, intervention in labor markets. If you look at the countries with the most economic freedom, it's your Norway, Scandinavia, Singapore. So not countries that people generally think of capitalist, but again, so it kind of depends on how you define capitalist. In a non-classical liberal world, I mean, give me socialism or communism, it would lead, I mean, that is what actually leads to dictatorships or oligarchies. So I would say that you can have welfare in a capitalist state. So you could be like Norway, which has a very strong social safety net, but a very lax regulatory environment with taxes that don't punish enterprise. So I'm a long way of saying it depends how you define capitalism. Look at the alternatives. Capitalist countries tend to be more equal, and in terms of unequal distribution of income and wealth, I'd say a lot of that's been driven by government intervention. So if you look at housing, it is the largest source of wealth for Australians that the government has just continuously pumped up the value of. If you were to have strong capitalism and free markets in housing, prices would be lower, and you would see the money shift from housing to something else that is not just a block of land with a structure on it. So, yeah.
Well, Anthony can engage with this if he likes, but the follow-up point that I was going to make was, well, aren't capitalist societies unequal by definition? I mean, since 2020, I guess you could say part of the reason was because of the lockdowns and the fact that big business did better than small business during those lockdowns, but wealth inequality has grown significantly since then. And when you have more money to play with, you can invest it in certain companies, and it's a lot easier to compound that wealth. And there's lobbying groups for the government in Australia and in the United States. So, and that's a way that the wealthy can influence politics. So, isn't it a bit of a misleading statement to say that capitalist societies are more equal by definition?
So, you brought up that our capitalist societies are they inherently unequal? I don't think I'd want to live in a society with total equality if it's measured by something like equality of outcome. I've been working since, I was 12, and I taught myself to invest at 13 and onwards. I don't really think that I should be completely equal with someone who has never worked and is the same age as me. So I'll take your point that I'll agree they are inherently unequal. Every society is. You get broader inequality in a communist or socialist country than you do a capitalist economy. On wealth inequality in Australia, I'm not sure what your metric is that you're using to measure it. If you look at the Gini coefficient, which is the standard way that you measure the distribution, it really hasn't changed since 2020. So if you look at it for both wealth and income, it's pretty flat. But assuming you give me some other index that shows that inequality has gotten bigger, I would say yes, because the government printed an absolute boatload of money. There was a lot of corporate welfare. If you had more lax regulation against housing wealth would collapse. Or not collapse, but it would be significantly lower. And yes, there is a compounding effect to having money and then investing it. But people lose money all the time. Rich people frequently lose tons of money on investment. I mean, investments are by their nature often very risky. And people often lose money. Look at venture firms. They lose absolutely tons of money, and they're funded by rich people. So money can be made, sure, but it can also be lost very easily.
So I guess the whole thing we've been talking about here is whether classical liberalism is just for the rich and whether it kind of just leads to masses of inequality and kind of an unfair society. I disagree for a number of reasons. The first thing is that something that's very important to a lot of classical liberals is social mobility, the ability for you to start off kind of quite poor and make your ways to the highest echelons of society. As long as we have a functioning society in which people can move from experiences of kind of poverty to kind of richness and success, I think our society is functioning well. That's why myself as a classical liberal, I'm a strong supporter of us providing public education to people, because that's a pathway to allow people to move through the social classes and something that's quite important. I'd also point to classical liberalism isn't just a bunch of rich people with monocles. A lot of classical liberals believe in stuff like universal healthcare. They believe in basic welfare supports. Not everyone does, but I'm one that does, and I'd support classical liberalism from the point of view that I like a lot of what's going into the status quo. How I approach the status quo is looking for more deregulation and more ways to make the economy efficient instead of just completely slashing all welfare. That's not something that I would hold. It's something that some classical liberals may hold, but not all of them. Finally, I'd like to address the idea of wealth inequality increasing in Australia and kind of greater income inequality. Yes, in certain circumstances, that can be a problem when you have a restriction of social mobility, when you have a situation in which lobbyists begin to control government policies, and when you have an over-monopolization of the economy. But I don't think it's necessarily an issue if it's just occurring because people are producing more businesses that are more efficient and they're maximizing their profits. It depends on what is the other factors that are occurring on the economy. And my response wouldn't be just necessarily rich people are earning more money, let's just tax them a lot more. It might be things like passing legislation which puts restrictions on lobbyists. It might look like in investigating if there's monopolies occurring in the economy and looking at ways to address those monopolies. But how a classical liberal will approach the solution to this issue will vary. Some will go, monopolies, that's fine, let's not touch them. Others might want to bust these monopolies, and it just depends from classical liberal to classical liberal. My overarching point I'd like to make here is it's hard to make a broad sweeping statement like all classical liberals believe this, or wealth inequality increasing is just necessarily bad. These issues are a lot more nuanced than just a simple kind of sweeping of the paintbrush, I guess.
Yeah, sorry, just quickly. So in terms of, if you look at the US and the billionaires that have been created in the last, say, I think it was 10 years, there's a USHIG paper on this that I implore people to read, but a majority of recent billionaires, it's not inherited wealth. And about, I want to say off the top of my head, 10 to 20% came from low income or working class backgrounds. So if a clear majority, are not inheriting in it, then a lot of these people are getting wealthy by creating amazing things, by producing goods and services that I love to use. I love my mouse, my phone, my AirPods, my computer. I mean, these things. Yes, the person who made it or invested in early to give it the startup funding, maybe they're very wealthy and I'm not. I've still benefited massively.
So thanks for engaging with those critiques from the left. Let's shift over to the right. So critiques from more protectionist or isolationist elements of the political right. What would you say what would be your response to the recent push to reshore manufacturing in Australia? Albanese's got his, what is it called? Future Made in Australia.
Future Made in Australia.
Andrew Hastie has been promoting what he's called, red Toryism or something to that effect.
Holden Commodore being the greatest manufactured car in history, I think.
Well, yeah, he's been sort of promoting domestic manufacturing, reshoring as well. There's an argument from people who are more protectionist on economics, which is, well, we can't have a fully free trading world system when China's building up manufacturing capacity and can easily convert that over to manufacturing drones or tanks or whatever. Australia needs to have factories that can produce those things in times of war, especially since we're geographically isolated. What's your argument or your view on that argument?
You can start.
So I'm going to preface this by Sam and me will probably have wildly different answers to this.
Wildly.
Wildly. I'd like to split my answer into two things. I'd like to address kind of the national security claim, and then I'd like to think about more broadly, like bringing more manufacturing onshore. From a national security standpoint, I think that's a valid argument. I think during the corona epidemic, we saw that we were unable to get access to vital medical supplies like face masks, hand sanitizers, because we were reliant upon importing that stuff in a situation in which the global economy essentially shut down. So if we just kind of extrapolate that to a war, we could see kind of there being a massively disastrous impact on Australia's ability to wage a defensive war. So I think, yes, there's an argument to be made that we might want to have more onshoring of vital industries to ensure that we could deal with like a global epidemic or a war in the future. And I think that is a valid argument, which I would probably support generally. Then if we look broadly to more kind of wanting to onshore manufacturing into Australia and looking at like maybe having more refinement of natural resources on Australian shores or even just manufacturing cars again, that's when I become to be a bit more skeptical, because we saw in the 1980s we were having issues with inflation, low productivity growth, when we had high protectionism in place, and when we reduced it we saw 30 years of unparalleled economic growth. So that the data seems to support protectionism not being a good idea. But I am, having said that, open to experiment with perhaps more onshoring, whether it be some government policies to increase infrastructure so that we can have more support for domestic industries. But if we're talking like putting broad-ranging tariffs on countries like China or India, I'm not convinced that that's going to be a solution, because we haven't seen that really working in the United States with the protectionism that they've been employing over there. The last thing I might add is that I do semi-subscribe to the point that the argument could be made that countries like China are being unfairly competitive with Australia because of lax labour or environmental regulations. So there is perhaps an argument to be made that you could have protectionism which tries to redress the cost imbalance between China, India and Australia due to us having tougher environmental and labour regulations, which, if we're thinking pragmatically, would never be removed in Australia. So the only solution to redress their negative economic impact on our competitiveness would be to try and price in that cost into imports. And that's something that I might perhaps be open to. But again, the economic data doesn't seem to support the idea that protectionism is broadly a good idea.
So you'd support, say, a carbon import tax?
I don't know. I'd
So-
say I'd be interested to see how that would play out, and if it had a positive or negative impact.
Sam, what do you reckon on reshoring manufacturing?
Hell no. I think it is a atrocious idea. I mean, I'll get into why I think the future made in Australia will fail, and so would any plan by Andrew Hastie. I take cars. I drive a car made in Japan. I love it. I don't want a car made in Australia. And you know what? If you wanted a car made in Australia and you wanted to pay 100% premium, maybe you're paying $50,000 for a car made in Australia that I could get in Japan for $25,000. I think that's fine. I don't think when faced with the choice, people are actually going to opt for an Australian car that costs twice as much. So I'd say, I'm a proud globalist, proud free trader. I think there are valid concerns around national security. I want to be wary though, because you'll have thinkers like Adam Smith, who's some would say is a classical liberal. Even Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek made some concessions for national security. However, I think we should be very wary of the government acting on some industrial policy under the guise of national security, when in reality it's just industrial policy. So, when in the US, when Biden blocked the acquisition of, I think it was Nikon Steel, on the grounds of national security, that was a complete lie. It was just economic nationalism. So I like to import things. I like buying things at a cheaper price with a higher quality. I think if we wanted to make... We still have manufacturing in this country. So 10 to 12% of our GDP from the last time I checked is manufacturing. It's not like it doesn't exist anywhere. I would be in favor of manufacturing policy if it meant heavy deregulation of things like industrial policy, permitting, and making energy cheaper, in which case you'd have people manufacture here because it's a good economic proposition and a good business proposition. I'm skeptical of the government intervening and trying to onshore manufacturing that I would way rather be done in China. The future man in Australia is going to give, I think it's about $500 million or $1 billion to manufacture solar panels. That is ludicrous. I mean, I would way rather import Chinese solar panels at a vastly lower price. So, no, I'm quite passionately and vociferously against the future made in Australia and probably whatever Andrew Hastie is planning to do with making cars in Australia.
Well, I'll probe Sam as a follow-up to that. Then what... I mean, you've acknowledged that there are some national security concerns, at least, even if there are also there is also some economic nationalism at play in some of the decisions that have been made in Western governments in recent years. If China is competing unfairly economically, let's say, then is the private sector not incapable of countering that? And are there not also concerns about BYD, for example, for a Chinese car that's currently being sold in Australia, about potential security or cybersecurity risks from that? Like, how does the problem of national security get solved?
So I'm going to preface this with, I'm not a national security policy wonk. It's another area in which I'm not as confident speaking on. My point was more that I in some ways accept that there could be some role for government intervening for national security purposes. I just want to make it clear that I think we should be very careful about what could just be industrial policy that's made to seem like national security. On EVs specifically, again, not an area I'm particularly familiar with on the national security, but the US has a ton, Europe has a ton of them, Chinese EVs. So the US has a ton, Australia has a ton, Canada, most Western countries have a lot. I think it's weird that this wasn't brought up earlier, and I think that from talking to someone like Jenny Gordon, who's a a researcher here at the ANU, but spent a lot of time at the Productivity Commission. She said to something along the lines of, there are certain software updates that hyperlink or something, and you can regulate that. So if it's a genuine concern, which I'm not sure it is, given why is it popping up now and not 5-10 years ago? And yeah, I mean, we could refine critical minerals here. We don't have great technology, but it is heavily energy intensive. If you protect these industries on the grounds of national security, one, they're probably never going to be competitive, or they might not be competitive, and if they're not in the long run, they're just going to end up completely dependent on taxpayer money, and that's something that would probably drive wealth inequality, right? Gina Reinhart's benefiting from taxpayer money to protect her from competitors. And the other reason would be, it's a heavily regulated system. I think it'd be grossly inefficient to subsidize something that we've actively made really hard to do that could be done in a more free market economy.
Did you have anything to add, Anthony, or shall I move on to the next question?
I just wanted to kind of add that, look, I'm not really supportive of tariffs or protectionism to kind of...
Do you want to make cars in Australia?
Well, I think if we were able to, I wouldn't object to it, but I don't think we should be making cars in Australia just because we want to, and basically put a lot of tariffs on to achieve this outcome. I'd be more supportive of policies which are trying to increase infrastructure, increase the human capital, lower energy costs to make the dream of creating cars on Australian soil profitable. I don't think the answer is just to increase taxation or increase protectionism. I think we need to kind of look at the fundamentals of the economy, like why don't we have that comparative advantage? And looking at ways to give us that comparative advantage would be more my solution, instead of just like doing protectionism, because we've seen it hasn't been working in the United States. Costs have been starting to go up. So, and they're the big experiment, right? Seeing how these policies play out in the United States. And if it's not successful there, I don't see why it would be successful in Australia.
Yeah,
Yep, you go.
I just say the nature of our economy is such that we are a small, open market economy, and we rely a lot more on trade. So Australia has, 26, 27 million people? The US has about 330, 340 million. So you could produce a lot more in areas with maybe maybe Texas has a comparative advantage in producing something than in Florida or California, but Australia doesn't have the domestic population size that larger economies do that allows them to cope more with protectionist policies. So I think Australia would be uniquely at a disadvantage. And then the other thing is, if we start protecting certain things, then maybe other countries think, oh, well, you know what, we're going to protect manufacturing here as well. And then we get autarkism, and that would just be really terrible. I mean, prices would go up for consumers. Lower income households would be hit the worst. So, yes, against industrial policy broadly.
One more critique I'd like you to respond to from the more isolationist right. It's actually a divide that I saw when I went to CAC, the Conservative conference in Brisbane a few weeks ago. Stephen Chavura, he's a sort of right-wing political commentator. He heckled Ted O'Brien's speech, the deputy leader of the Liberal Party, and he said, Ted O'Brien was speaking about Australian values, and obviously that was pretty well connected with classical liberalism. But Stephen Chavura, he interrupted Ted O'Brien's speech briefly and said, "It's the people, not the values, mate." And I guess this sort of connects to a broader contention that is made on some parts of the right that I'd like you guys to respond to, which is the claim that you can't have a society founded on the principles of classical liberalism, on individual rights, on limited government and free markets, if you don't have a culture, if you don't preserve and protect a culture that has those values, that sort of government and ideology rest on top of a cultural group. I guess that'd be the more cultural conservative argument. How do you respond to that?
I'm going to hand this off to Anthony, and in quite due time, because this is something I don't have a clear answer to. It's not something I've thought enough about, so I'm going to kind of opt out and give it to Anthony.
I guess it sort of touches on immigration as well. That's usually where it's brought up on the right, but I assume you guys are aware of that.
I think so. I think the way I'd answer that is firstly kind of observing that Australia is a multicultural society, and no matter what people on the right might want to happen, that isn't going to change. So
I love immigration.
So I don't think that it's actually the people like what the color of everyone's skin is that matters. I think that something that is necessary for a society is for there to be like at least some values that people commonly believe in, whether it's just something as much as like I support like I like Australia or something. Like you don't actually have to think the government policies that are occurring are good, but you believe in kind of the idea of building the country into being a better kind of place, I suppose. So I think there's certain civic values that are important to maintain functioning society. Things like having respect for each other, having commitment to obey the laws of the nation, things like that. But I think it's very difficult for you to kind of prescribe like what are Australian values, what is our culture exactly, because it's been changing quite a lot rapidly. So what I'd say is maybe this is something that we as a society have to think about a lot more and a lot more deeply in what does it mean to be Australian? Because I think that is an important question to answer. And I think it's something that's important to our society being cohesive, that we all kind of support Australia as an idea, whatever that idea may end up being. Because I guess countries that are unified tend to be quite successful because they're able to
like Japan.
Well, yeah, but even they're able to engage in robust debate without tearing apart. So when you're able to go home after like having like a vigorous debate with someone in Parliament and still be able to like play a cricket match or like still sit around the dining table without strangling the person next to you, I think that's when you have a good society. And I think that relies upon all of you knowing that you have good intentions and that you subscribe to some baseline ideas like we support our democracy, we support equal rights for people. So yeah, it's a hard question that I think we need to think about a lot more as Australians.
Yeah, I'm going to revise my answer slightly, because this isn't something I've thought about enough to give you a proper answer. But, I don't think people are coming to Australia because they want to impose communism or an Islamic caliphate. I think people, I have international friends from Sri Lanka so one of my best friends is an international student, he's Sri Lankan, and he loves economic freedom. And he's come to Australia to study for various reasons, but amongst them is to stay in Australia because he loves the idea of being free economically, coming from a country, Sri Lanka, that is not free in any sense of the word, especially economically. So I do think a lot of people who come to this country do share some of the views around free speech, democracy, the government not stealing your money with a marginal rate of tax of 80%. But it's just a thought I had, but I can't give you it's a good question though. I'll think about it.
Coming back to the Liberal Party, we've sort of briefly skirted around the state of the Liberal Party. I'd like you guys to give your assessment on where the Liberal Party is at the moment. We've had weeks or months actually of instability in the coalition, the Liberal Party more specifically since the election. There's been resignations, there's been cabinet reshuffles, and the picture at the moment is, if I'm frank, one of a bit of chaos. What do you think the state of the Liberal Party is right now, and which direction do you hope it goes in? Which direction do you think it's going to go in?
Yeah, I'll start. So, clearly it's in a bit of chaos, and there isn't any internal agreement about where to go. where I would really like to see the Liberal Party move to is more, I guess, classical liberal. So socially a bit more progressive, and then economically, I would really like to see some strong policy around deregulation, cutting government spending, removing itself from the economy as much as possible, changing laws around venture capital and superannuation funds so we can have some dynamism, so we can fund entrepreneurs and startups before they move to US, because it's just a way better place to go if you're a startup. So the place I'd like to see the Liberal Party move to is economically a lot more classically liberal, and socially, I don't have a particular view. So my perspective is economically, I'd like to see it embrace the free market more than it does.
So I think the Liberal Party clearly has a lot of problems. They won around 5 urban seats at the last election. No seats in Perth, Adelaide, Hobart, Brisbane. That's a lot of major cities without representation. So it's clearly they've got a problem. We've got the Allen government in Victoria, which is widely
cannot
unpopular.
Stop spending and taxing and regulating.
It's clearly not a very good government. But somehow the Liberal Party looks in no position to regain government against a terrible government, which would indicate that there's like a massive problem going on here. Even the Kiama by-election recently, the Liberal Party lost that seat to an incumbent government. It's never good when you lose a by-election of a seat you held to an incumbent government. So there's clearly a lot of problems with the Liberal Party. If I were broadly to break it down into a couple of issues, the first one I'd like to point out is increasing their appeal to multicultural Australians. So we're looking at seats like Bennelong, we're looking at Western Sydney. I'm not sure where the representation is in Melbourne because I'm not from there, but etc. across Australia.
Maybe Menzies, that's a multicultural.
Yeah, like Menzies.
Didn't the Liberals lose Menzies in the last election?
Because of their loss of Chinese Australian voters. So the first thing is to kind of stop antagonising Chinese Australians by accusing the CCP of kind of intervening in every Australian election. That seems to me to be like an obvious way to straight away have more appeal. Secondarily on this point, I feel like a lot of multicultural Australians are hardworking Australians who are small business owners, who have young families. These are kind of the bread and butter voters that the Liberal Party should be winning. So they need to be looking at their messaging around issues like immigration, around foreign policy, to be more sensitive to these voters, because if I was from these communities, I'd probably think the Liberal Party might be a little bit racist from some of the messaging that has been coming out from certain individuals in the party and the broader right-wing ecosystem. So dealing with that, I think, automatically puts them in a much better position to win key seats, which would get them into government again. Then we need to look at this kind of whole urban problem. And when I talk about urban, what I'm really meaning here is the seats that they lost to the Teals. And I think a key problem why they lost these seats is they lost young voters and they lost female voters, and more broadly, they lost socially liberal voters, who were their key bread and butter, the fiscal conservative, but thinks that abortion should be legal and that climate change is a serious issue for them to grasp with. So I think that if the Liberal Party can seriously rehabilitate their image on climate change and do broad outreach to female voters, I think they can hope to win some of these seats back. And this is going to be very difficult because there's been years of kind of their negative imaging on these two issues. So I think things like looking at who they're pre-selecting as candidates to increase female representation, more female shadow ministers, more policies that are supporting women, these might be the kind of things that can help them to build up their support there. And with younger voters, I guess it's just kind of being more socially liberal and kind of, I think it's even just important about how they're phrasing certain issues, and then not just phrasing, but genuinely trying to reach out to younger voters to try and actually defend the liberal values so that people can see why they should be supporting them. Like, why are free markets a good idea? Why is kind of our policy a good idea?
Yeah, terrible communication.
So yeah, just kind of fighting and being strong for your values is a very important thing. The final thing I would note is that I think a big issue at the last election is it was very unclear what was going to change under a Dutton-led government, so they didn't have a very clear vision to the voters about some key policies.
Like zero policy.
Yeah, so I think the Liberal Party needs to think very seriously about having an ambitious set of policies to bring to the Australian public at the next federal election. And then I think they need to think very seriously about how they're going to communicate those policies to the Australian public. If they kind of deal with these issues, hopefully they will be in a better position at the next election, I suppose.
Yeah, and if
Well,
I was...
you go. Yeah, you go.
Sorry, I'd just say... I guess maybe I'm gonna take your job here for a second. If we were to say who we'd like to see the leaders look to for advice in terms of which MPs, which ministers, shadow ministers, I'd probably say Tim Wilson, Andrew Bragg. Who's the young guy from Victoria?
James Paterson.
James Paterson. So those types of people who are a lot more, focused on economic freedoms. Who would you say?
I broadly agree. I think someone like Julian and Lisa, people who have strong convictions and are willing to stand up for their values, because I think that's something that we haven't seen from conservatives in Australia generally, is the ability to stand up for one's values and defend them, but also not to be blinded by ideology and not to turn off audiences. So we don't want to kind of defend our values if they're kind of alienating a large swath of Australians, like some figures will be willing to on things like immigration. We want to be fighting for values, but also making sure values align with what the Australian public in general believes in.
These are all the things you'd like to see happen with the Liberal Party. What percentage chance do each of you, just quickly, what percentage chance do each of you think the Liberal Party has of doing that?
So,
Doesn't have to be exact, just a ballpark.
Oh, ballpark. Yeah.
Well, Susan
Do
Ley.
you think it's likely or unlikely they're going to do
Susan
it?
Lay's the leader, but how long for is a question. I mean, what's the probability of her getting...
Well, the right faction seem to be stabbing Hastie in the back in the media a bit.
Good,
so.
good. Andrew Hastie is the opposite of where I'd like to see the Liberal Party go.
He does have strong conviction in his values, though. Which is...
The guy wants to manufacture... You want to buy an Australian car, Anthony? You want to pay double?
We've already covered the cars, guys.
Yeah,
Just wanted to more likely, less likely.
Percentage chance. In the direction that I would like it to go, which is more small government in the economy, economic freedom, 70, 80%.
Anthony, what do you reckon?
I'm kind of in two minds. I'm a bit scared that it could go downhill, but I think given who they elected as leader, I'm optimistic that everyone in the party is trying to be constructive to build a policy platform that's going to be appealing to the majority of Australians. Even looking like how they dealt with the controversial statements of Jacinta Allen-Price on Indian immigrants and how they kind of made a very direct effort to appeal to those communities and rebuild ties gives me a lot of confidence. So I'd say around the same, 70 to 80. I'm generally quite confident that the Liberal Party, which has in fact won the most federal elections in Australian history, is going to be able to respond to a devastating defeat because they always have.
So, gentlemen, where can my audience find you on the interwebs?
On the interweb, on the intranet.
We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. Can I get a second to pull up our actual stuff?
So our Instagram
Absolutely.
is...
We can pop the links on the screen now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pretty much any social media, www.anucls.com, and on our Instagram is anuclsoc. And if you look up ANU Classical Liberal Society on Facebook or LinkedIn, you'll be able to find it.
Yeah, and we have a lot of regular content. We do interviews, podcasts. We have exciting policy statements on what the Allen government's doing on work from home. We have some newspaper articles about Sri Lanka, about kind of HEX debt, which are also very good reads.
And people can find you on campus as well if they're at ANU and was it UNSW?
So
Yeah.
we're currently at ANU and we're in the process of expanding to UNSW. But yes, if you're at ANU, I guess this won't go out in time, but we'll be down there Tuesday. But we're going to try and get out on campus next year, once a week or every 2 weeks to spark up a bit of debate.
And final question, why should young people be interested in current affairs?
That's a really good question. For me, I would say that, in my view, Australia is going down a dark path, I think. A decline in economic freedom will not serve us well, especially lower income and working class Australians. And something like a social media ban, there's a lot of things that will affect us. Debt, we're going to have to repay this back. So I think it's important to stay up to date so that you're engaged in the politics and, can vote with the confidence knowing that with the confidence that you know what is going on and what party is going to serve you best, whatever party that may be.
So I think current affairs is just fun. I don't know. I've always enjoyed it. So I think, and there's a wide array of things you could be interested, whether it's like kind of foreign affairs, wars, Australian politics, US politics. I think there's something there for everyone. Even just looking at it historically, it's just very interesting. Watching the cool colors on the US election board turn blue or red, like, I don't know if that's your thing. Maybe that's your thing, or playing
that's my thing. That's my thing.
Or playing like Hearts of Iron 4. I don't know. There's a lot of fun stuff to be in here. It's a very exciting thing. The most exciting thing though about it is that it tangibly affects you, right? Being engaged in this political system, learning about this stuff allows you to be a more informed voter. It allows you to write to your MP or to public officials and kind of motivate for change towards policies that tangibly affect you. And I think it's kind of our responsibility as voting Australians to be informed about the issues so that we can make informed decisions when we vote for issues, instead of just complaining in a pub that, oh, the bloody government again, it's done it. Oh no, Gary, it's like you actually knowing about why the government's done something wrong and being able to have a targeted response to that is something so empowering and so important for every Australian.
And it'll also help impress your parents or your partner's parents.
It's good dinner time conversation.
And for employers, if we're thinking about more strictly economically rational reasons as to why you should follow.
I should have expected that from the classical liberals. The economic argument straight away.
If you can tell your employer what's happening in the economy and what the inflation rate is and what inflationary expectations
What is the inflation rate, Sam?
The most recent underlying or headline?
Of course he asked that.
Headline is I think about 2.7, underlying about 3.1.
We'll have to fact check him on that.
Well, gentlemen, every time I speak to someone who is a young person interested in politics or a young person involved in politics to some degree like yourselves, I realise there are more and more Hearts of Iron 4 players among us who are hiding and lurking, and it's nice to see them outside the house and touching some grass. But anyway, Anthony, Sam, thank you. You've been fantastic guests. I appreciate you engaging with those criticisms. And look, people in the audience, make up your mind. If you think they were dog and classical liberalism's dog, then obviously don't associate with them. But if you think it's a pretty cool thing, then check them out. I guess judgment's up to you. Anyway, thanks guys. See ya.
Amazing. Thank you, Max. Cheers.